negotiations and do not want to see the negotiations go forward. So that's another thing to watch and to monitor, I think, very carefully.
So I think that's obviously a great description of the lay of the land, the politics of the globe. And it's, I think it's better if you look at NAFTA and the scholarship around it and the various regional agreements. The scholarship suggests that essentially you're better off having participated in the agreements early on than come in as a later participant. So essentially, if there's a movement afoot to have a 76 country agreement, let's imagine that 50 countries ultimately agree on something. You may well find it harder to gain entry later. So I think it's foolish of these countries to actually stay out. And so I think there's, all countries should be thinking about how do we create a digital economy, how do we, participate in global trade that is increasingly digital. And so I think all these countries should be at the table and raising their concerns and having them discussed.
Thank you. It's always struck me in the World Trade Organization context that there are, a few members out there like India and South Africa that are kind of, I think, motivated by the politics of the venue to take a particular position, and then they see power in blocking or obstructing. And then there's this mass of other members that really can't care that much or have can't see benefit from not participating. And so how do you free them and get them into the process would be, I think if the process gets going, you may well find that there are more in the middle of the roaders that say why not. So Josh, I think you might have said something, we were mentioning the EU's views, in particularly privacy, and thought there is a way forward between particularly the United States and the EU, and finding the right balance between a firm obligation and appropriate deference for privacy policy. Can you elaborate
on that? Sure. I mean, this is more than any other issue that I've observed in digital trade. This is one that has just almost taken on kind of a theological quality on both sides and really around the world. And it's kind of become cartoonish in a way, quite honestly, where the U.S. approach is one that, and what I'm talking about is the ways that people talk about it separate from what the text is. The U.S. approach is often misrepresented and cartoonified as being, wholly in disregard of privacy interests. There is a feeling, and I see this in tons of different settings every day, that commitment to privacy in the United States is nowhere near what it is in Europe, and that sort of the move fast and break things model characterizes every aspect of digital policy. The European approach is misrepresented and cartoonified as being one that will sacrifice innovation at the altar of regulation, that a lot of privacy rules are driven by more underlying jealousy of U.S. commercial success, particularly in the technology sector. And there's a real absence of just sort of thoughtful discussion and listening. In practice, the economies are so integrated, and despite having differences of views, there are established ways of moving data that are responsive to privacy interests. There is a much greater commitment to privacy in the United States than is often thought. I don't know if people are paying attention to the debate over U.S. privacy legislation. And if you for those trade lawyers and former trade negotiators among us, if you look at the actual text, I think, and I'll just limit this to myself, I think it can be overcome. And when I'm talking about text, I'm talking about sort of the model approaches of the two economies. The hearts are in the right place. They're not quite in the same place, but they're much closer to each other than the public representations would suggest. And so one theme that we've begun talking about, and I think we'll continue to talk about in addition to looking at the nuts and bolts of the text that has been offered, is to think more expansively about the ways in which the US and the EU in specific terms, but just different people around the world, for the most part, view how data flows and privacy interact, and the various mechanisms that have been established, whether you're talking about the Privacy Shield framework between the US and the EU, whether you're talking about something known as model contract clauses, which are a well-established tool that the General Data Protection Regulation in the EU enshrines for companies to move data, whether you're talking about the APEC cross-border privacy rules. We spend so much time fighting over theological positions on privacy, but we've got tools. We need to make them work better. We need to make sure they're clear and that traders and investors and companies and businesses have certainty about what they'll be able to do. But the practical problems, while they are real in our view, are smaller and more manageable than sort of the public representations of them would have you believe.
Professor?
So I just wanted to echo that. The substantial gulf that is suggested between Europe and the United States on privacy is less substantial when it's interrogated further. So where is Cambridge Analytica based? What country is it based? It's based in the UK. Where is the Facebook entity that interface with Cambridge Analytica based? It's based in Ireland. So those transactions were entirely governed by European data protection law. So the Cambridge Analytica disaster was not a failure of US law, it was a failure of European law enforcement. Okay? And so that's the reality of that transaction. Of course, there's failures in US law in the sense that US information was also captured, etc. But the principal contracts that were in operation were between two European entities. And so if you look at the FTC settlement that is being suggested, it ranges from $3 to $5 billion. That's the suggestion that against Facebook that's soon to be coming. If it's the GDPR, as you know, has a 4% of global turnover penalty that's available to the authorities. Well, 4% of global turnover turns out to be much less than $5 billion. And so this is actually, if the FTC enacts a $5 billion settlement against Facebook, it turns out to be a higher penalty than the European authorities could impose at their maximum, right? So, the U.S. actually does have a substantial privacy system. There's nothing more frightening than a U.S. class action lawyer. So that sends chills into companies' bones. And so, U.S. Plaintiffs' abilities are pretty starkly greater than the rest of the world. We don't have the loser pays and various other things that discipline plaintiffs across the world. And so we allow for punitive damages, all kinds of other things that make the U.S. system actually far more strict than might first appear. So there's the law in the books, and then there's the procedural issues and the enforcement capacities that actually make things very different than they might initially appear on their surface.
Just to add to the mix, don't disagree that there's a lot to work with there, and various mechanisms, whether it's contracts, clauses, Privacy Shield, and others. But just to add, looking at the financial services sector, they're not necessarily covered. So that's another piece, and it's a fairly challenging piece that needs to be addressed. So again, not saying that I don't think it's something that can't be ultimately worked through, but I think that getting everybody covered in terms of the privacy protections in a reasonable way is going to be quite a challenge.
Thank you. Let's open the floor for some questions.
And we're going to have a mic runner come around. If people can please identify yourself and your affiliation, and please keep your question brief, that would be appreciated.
François, way back.
Far back as possible.
Is it me, or does this room remind you of an airplane?
Jean-François Boitin with AFEP, French Business Roundtable. So, a question to the panel, how much do you think you can isolate that negotiation from the broader trade policy context and decisions that are taken in particular in this country? And specifically, if we see a wave of so-called national security 232 actions, why would not countries in that negotiation insist on the fact that their national security is much more endangered by data flows than by imports of whatever, gas, uranium, steel, aluminum?
Thank you. Josh?
I have one thought, which is, I mean, obviously you can't isolate what happens in any negotiating setting from the larger political environment. It's, they're human beings. They're affected by the larger political, sort of motivations and feelings of their governments. So that would absolutely be a dynamic. But I think in a way, a more practical dynamic would be the policy dynamic. I was thinking about this on the way in today, that the outcome of the U.S.-China discussions will have significant impacts on this. It concerns a lot of the same subject matter. And so, if the U.S. and China can come to some sort of meaningful accord that addresses many of the systemic issues with Chinese policies and practices, that could provide a roadmap for many of the issues, if not all, in this exercise, and vice versa. So they're absolutely all related to each other.
Sorry. So I just wanted to mention the Grinder case. I don't know if you've been following this, right? This raises very significant questions. So just to recap quickly, the CFIUS committee, which reviews foreign investments in the United States, ruled that a Chinese company that had purchased the American dating app Grindr had to divest itself for national security reasons. That suggests that national security can be the truck-sized loophole into any trade agreement that arises. And so it's a little bit of a, because even something as simple as a weather app, which collects your location information, could then become national security data, and therefore subject to controls that say you can only allow our favored people to own such companies. So every company is gathering personal information if they are operating via the internet, and so that makes that national security loophole way too frightening. And the United States position on this today is not as would not leave some of these questions to an international discipline as I think would be proper. The WTO is thinking about this, I think, in a sophisticated way. The recent panel ruling, and we'll see what happens, as this moves forward.
Kristen?
Just quickly to add, absolutely, I think the Ukraine case is important because there was some cabining in very usefully, I think. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. But to Jean-François' question, I think, fortunately, that the tensions and the broader trade environment have not prevented negotiations from going forward so far, and including the U.S. engaging very actively. So But I think the rubber will definitely hit the road when negotiations get into exceptions and the security exception and how that's applied. And as you say, the environment going on around the globe and what the U.S. is doing on 232 and other areas. But I think it's a little bit more down the road.
Thank you, Christine. Any other questions? Someone to the right? Good.
Thank you all very much, Rachel Pfeffer from CRS. I was just curious when you talk about the developing countries and potential for things like trade facilitation and capacity building. It was very clear with the WTO TFA what sort of capacity building or trade assistance could be given to developing countries, because that's very much a kind of physical, hands-on world, a lot of what they needed, as well as regulatory development and such. So I was curious, I think someone mentioned cybersecurity cooperation, but what other type of capacity building or assistance could be given under this potential negotiation or potential agreement?
Thank you.
Sure. So you hear Alibaba talking about this all the time, right? So their principal suggestion is we are building platforms for SMEs across the world to trade with the rest of the world, right? So they have their paradigm is very much focused on how can we create logistics systems that help countries in Africa trade with the rest of the world. And I think that kind of concerted effort as a kind of foregrounding. So I'm foregrounding development concerns in this. I think is critical, and I think that should be something that U.S. companies, press as their goals as well. And so I think that's an important thing.
Thank you. That's great. There are two questions side by side to the right there. The gentleman was first, I believe.
Hi, thanks for an excellent panel. Jim Fothery with GR Group Asia. I'm going to struggle with the question a little bit, but the Europeans had this concept of the right to be forgotten. How close are we to a world where consumers could say, I want a right to be paid for my data? And the reason that I mention that is that I saw an article in the Nikkei just this morning where two Japanese companies are developing business models where they're going to allow consumers to get rebates or discounts on cable television services or something like that. In the context of the WTO agreement where we're talking about not allowing tariffs on e-commerce transactions, how would something like that factor into negotiations going forward? It seems like it could be a really complicated issue international. Professor, maybe you have a take on that.
So, by the way, I have a book. It's called The Electronic Silk Road from Yale University Press, and I encourage so how the web binds the world together in commerce. So it's very much in this area. There's a question of whether or not something like a free service, a service that is not paid with dollars but paid with data, is governed by international trade rules at all. And I think, so I've argued that in fact it has to be governed by these rules, that just because a service is not without financial payment doesn't mean that it's not actually an economic transaction that is part of the WTO framework as it currently exists. And so a company like Google, etc., or even Facebook are in fact able to benefit from the liberalization obligations under the General Agreement on Trade and Services, for example. And so I think the paradigm for these, but I think it's also important to recognize that there's trade flows that might exist not just in companies like Google or Facebook, but in the Internet of Things device that you have that is constantly sending information back and forth. And so how do we think about those kinds of devices as maybe for those. So what I suggest is that essentially the services flow should be thought of as a kind of already prepaid service when you buy the device, but essentially becomes then subject to the localization commitments of the services side as well. So I think there are ways to think about this. It's not the traditional commercial paradigm that we have, but we're coming to a world where a new kind of breed of services exists that we hadn't really grappled with before. But I think the rules are able to address that, and I think that, so I don't think we should, and so the financial flows have existed for almost 100 years, and so those companies were there at the Uruguay round thinking about these things even then.
Yeah, just a quick thought. I mean, great question, Jim. I don't, as a matter of policy, we read a lot and hear a lot about the idea. I don't personally see it as a short-term reality or a short-term sort of serious policy discussion without making a judgment on the idea. But what I think it does reflect is the point I was making earlier about having a globally coherent approach to the decisions that individual economies are going to make about their own public interests. And so the appetite for that kind of a legal right, the right to be, call it the right to be paid, will progress necessarily differently in different economies, and it may be more important in one place than in another. And economies may consider it, a sovereign area where they get to make the judgment. I think we'd all be doing ourselves a disservice if we didn't try to construct a global regime for accommodating data flows that wasn't, sensitive to and accommodative to those national differences, of course, within the parameters of kind of the larger values of generally being able to move data. So in other words, having interoperable systems that still respect national priorities that may differ from place to place.
Just very quickly, if I can add something. One is just respectfully, I think probably we would get into a debate about the coverage of whether or not it's covered under or could be covered under current rules. The other tricky thing about it is I think the question as to how accurately that kind of data is even measured. So how you would even capture it. I know the recent McKinsey study attempts to do that, but I think it's not there yet. And then the last point I would make, and it's not directly related to Jim's question, but it is to the broader issue of the kind of educating we need to do and the data we need. And that goes back to just the costs of not implementing a coherent digital trade policy and how that emerges. And one example that I mentioned earlier is the customs moratorium a moratorium on customs duties. And I think that's one area where it's useful to do some more work on the benefits that accrue from that, especially to medium and small size enterprises. And then in fact, opposing revenues could lead to even bigger society economic-wide loss.
Thanks, Christy. Just time for one last question. There was a lady to the back.
Hi, and thanks very much. The lady is Sherry Stevenson from the PEG Services Network. Great panel. Quick question. My understanding is that in the WTO, there has been a recent push to revitalize the services negotiations. As you know, the services negotiations have a mandate that is independent of the Doha round, so they can be pushed forward at any time. They never concluded. As Christine rightly said, there's so many mixed elements between services and data flows and digital trade in general. How do you see these two negotiations going forward? Is there any chance at all of a type of synergy? Will one eclipse the other because e-commerce is now garnering all the attention worldwide? I'm just curious if you have any inside kind of information or understanding about what is happening in Geneva there.
Thank you, Sharon.
Thank you, Sherry. So you're right that there has been some activity in terms of potential for market access discussions among the regular the Services Council and the Services Negotiating Groups, but it hasn't really taken off. And so again, my personal opinion, my view would be that probably you won't see a lot of activity in that context, but in the context of the e-commerce negotiations, a number of countries have been talking about including a market access element related to both goods and services that are related to e-commerce. So I think in terms of services market access, it's much more likely that you would see some type of negotiation included in the e-commerce negotiations, and far less likely that you would see activity in the Services Council.
Thank you. Okay, with that, we'll call this.
Both of you. Thank you, Chris. Thank you to our panel. Really grateful for your comments.